in one sentence. I was noticing now, I'm like, oh, no, one sentence arguments. So, two of them which actually said, I argue, or the main argument is. So, keep that in mind with your arguments as well. Like, that should be really blatantly obvious in abstract. So, speaking of arguments, so, we talked a little bit about arguments. And now we're going to talk a little bit about structure. But structure and argument are deeply interlinked. So this is something I do all the time. So your argument is your honey. It's the wonderful, sweet thing you want to eat. And your structure is the jar that holds it. So if you don't have a jar holding your honey, nobody's going to be able to get to it. It just spreads everywhere and no one's going to understand. Or in this case, no one's going to be able to eat it. If you have a jar, so a great structure, but no honey, well, what's the point, right? We're here for the honey. So, this is what we want. So we've talked a little bit about argument, and we've gotten you to write down in one word what your argument is. Now we're going to try to help you create a jar for it. So, welcome to my analogy, the honey in the jar.
You made us hungry now.
Yeah, I know. I was not thinking when I did that. All right. So let's talk a little bit about argument. So this comes from, oh gosh, for those that like history, this actually comes from Aristotle. So this is how old the notion of argument at British, Western European universities are. So this is sort of the elements that you always need in an argument, regardless of the type of argument, whether it's an academic argument, whether it's a public debate, whether it's policy, whether it's, politics. This is what you need in an argument. So first of all, you need an introduction and conclusion. I don't think anyone's surprised there. But your introduction should do certain things. So the first thing your introduction does is it lets us know, well, A, what's the debate? Like, what's the disagreement? And why it matters. Like, why should we care that you're writing this? Why do we care? Why does this matter? Why is this even worth entering into this debate? From there, contextualize it, because the debate will be different depending on where you're doing your work. So your introduction should give a little bit of a context. Then you need your argument. In one sentence or two, it can be a little bit longer. The abstract really needs to be one sentence. But very clearly stated, this paper argues, I argue, the overall argument is, whatever that is, make it clear. And then you need to forecast the structure. So some sort of statement of saying how you're going to make this argument. So what comes first, what's going to come next, and how are you going to conclude this? Right? So you're letting your audience know, not only this is my argument, but this is how I'm going to be making it. From there, now, and we'll talk about things like methodology, literature review, but regardless of the sections, you need to present the evidence that supports your argument. Okay? So this is using theory, using methodology, using data. What is each reason that your argument's correct? All right? So what are the reasons? And with each reason, what are the underlying data sets, underlying empirical evidence or theoretical evidence? And think of your audience. So you're writing to an academic community, right? You're not writing just to the editor or to the peer reviewer. You're writing to an entire, so be thinking about what are the views that that field normally has about this. And so when you speak to them, when you write, speak to them. So that's the first part. Then you also have to address those that disagree with you. All arguments must address alternative perspectives. So summarize what the alternative views currently are in the field, how other people might understand what you're talking about. It should be fair. Be fair to them. Just like you want them to be fair to you. Be fair to them. But then, refute or concede, right? So refute meaning, like, why is that not enough? What's missing? Why is your perspective better in terms of what are you thinking about that they forgot? What kind of data are you using that they've never used before? What methods are you using that they haven't used? So demonstrate why that doesn't work. And then you need a conclusion, which is more than just a summary. A conclusion is more than just a summary. Yes, you summarize your overall argument, but then you have to contextualize your argument within the field. So before we contextualize the debate. So what's the debate and what's the context of the debate? Now you're assuming you've convinced your audience, and so now you're contextualizing the argument. Why do we care that you're right? What does it mean that you're right? What are the implications of the fact that you're right? Okay? And then you answer, yeah, so what? Okay, what now? And so sometimes this comes up as future research suggestions, but it also can be future policy suggestions, considerations for what this means for the field, but some sort of consideration of what comes next. Where does this leave us in our fields? So that's an argument, which all of them are making. But we also know that there are sort of set sections to an article that we're expected to have. A lot of people have been talking about methodology. Data's been mentioned a little bit, so we know that there are sections. Yeah. Yeah, no, plural. So, in other words, there isn't just one alternative view. There may be many different views. The world is not one or the other, but actually, normally, there are many different perspectives. So don't just address one different perspective, address the different perspectives. So that's what I mean by plural. There are more than two. It's very rare that it's either or. It's normally multiple different perspectives. So take those into account. What are the different ways that people might see this? So going back to our definitions of critical thinking, you have to think about how others might view this, and then try to convince them that actually you're right. So it's that imagination. Now that you've imagined what a different perspective is, how do you now speak to them to convince them? And there's usually more than one. It's very rare that it's either, oranges or bananas, right? Normally it's a whole bunch of different choices. So this is normally what you see when you see journal articles. Slightly different settings, but normally you see an introduction, you see a conclusion, you see findings and discussions. Sometimes findings are separate from discussions, sometimes they're together. Sometimes there's a methodology. Well, I hope most times there's a methodology. And if so, why is your interpretation better? So once again, an argument. So you have many arguments that support your big argument. And then once again, the summary is the same. Do you see how the structure of a journal article, it is an argument, but it's got little arguments within it. So, this is what I want you to do, is exactly this. So, looking at your research, I'm going to give you 7 minutes. Nice odd number to keep it interesting. And I want you to answer these questions about your research. So take a few moments, write on a piece of paper. What are your answers to these questions? Because basically what you're doing is checking if you have a structure here, and if your structure fits into this argument. So on a piece of paper, write your answers. you wrote an abstract for this. So looking at that, now thinking of that research you did. Okay. Okay, great. So thinking of this research, answer those questions. So what is the debate in this research? So you're just answering these questions about this. No, this is the structure. So this, the abstract describes the research. Yes, the whole research answers these questions. So what is your research about? So what theory do you use in your research? How does it help you answer the questions?
Thank you.
Yeah, that's an abstract. Yeah, but in the methodology, are you explaining why this is important? Because it's not just describe my methodology, it's why this is better. Because this is an abstract, this is not, so I'm talking about the whole. But this is not abstract, this is journal. The whole. Yeah. Yeah. Just remember, most abstracts are about 2 or 3 words. So regardless of what you do, it has to be short. So I'm recommending that you do this tomorrow. So you would use this then to write the whole article? Well, ideally, when you're saying about one thing, about what is wrong, we should carry this. This is not an abstract, this is an outline. It's not an abstract, right? So structure, well, yeah, this is the plan, yes. Tomorrow, I have a whole hour and a half.
What's your that's also need how to connect with and why.
Tomorrow, trust me, we have an hour and a half to do tomorrow. We will talk about that. That's yes. So,
Find the gaps and how to address them.
Yes, exactly. Yes, recommendations totally different. Discussion totally different. The result of finding
For example,
that's one thing. That's discussion. That's discussion. No. So no. You have your findings, your results, your findings, what you found in the data, and then the discussion analyzes the findings. Discussion analyzes the findings. Trust me. Depends on the field. So some fields prefer the word findings, some fields prefer the word finding. That's the same way. Yes, but it's the same. It means the same thing. Well, when you analyze your findings, then you should sort of get to And that's what you're saying is, that is, so this particular research is only going to be focused on comparative analysis and personal experiences. It doesn't require, and as long as you explain why, but the key is to always say why or why.
إمام صالح هذا عمل لازم تبني خوش شو بيبوا أول تصوير منك بس إمام صالح
Yeah, but that's part of your why. So
Just like what I asked you about.
The implications should definitely be not in your discussion, but in your conclusion as well. It's not just something you do practically, but there are actual implications here. So that's sort of the area of debate. You know my argument, so, I don't have it up here, but my argument is basically that university students who attend these universities compromise between assimilating Western values while at the same time being critical of neoliberalism and neocolonialism that these institutions are. Okay, and then the structure of my debate, can I do that off the top of my head? That's a good one. This is a test. First I make arguments about how transnational higher education can be understood as a form of neocolonialism, as well as being informed by neoliberalism. And I would also be looking at previous literature that focuses all on host countries and universities, but nobody talks about students. Woohoo! Done. From there, my methodologies are interviews, narrative interviews specifically with students. From there I will use whatever. So what's my theoretical argument? That branch campuses are actually a form of neocolonialism where countries that they're from get to influence power on other countries, so soft power we were talking about, no, not so soft power. And also this is also informed by neoliberal values in terms of host universities want to make money, and it's a way of getting more international students without having them come to your country. Whereas host countries, so countries that host the universities, are interested in becoming more competitive in the global market, and therefore they think foreign universities will improve their human capital. Okay, so that's my theoretical argument. Are there other ways people could see it? Yep, some people claim that it's altruistic, that it is a desire to actually help other countries, and that it's driven by a desire to make people's lives better. I disagree. Methodology, so I'm doing narrative interviews, so this is basically asking students to tell me the experiences and stories of what it's like to study. So it's all about them telling me stories. I could have done surveys, but honestly, I don't think the data would have been deep enough. I don't think I would have gotten as many stories because people, when they do surveys, answer very shortly. And I could have done focus groups, but I think if I did focus groups, I wouldn't have as much as the critical side, that people wouldn't be as willing to open in front of each other about that. So I didn't do those. My findings, well, you know my findings, and you'll see tomorrow examples of my findings, but basically students were very aware that they were being assimilated and that they had to, and they wanted to be able to succeed in their studies, but at the same time were very critical of the curriculum and asking if the curriculum really mattered for their country and their context. And then, yeah. So you see how I did that? Off the top of my head.
Sorry, were you looking at the universities who are opening their campus in other parts of the world?
So I was talking to the students who studied at the campuses overseas. So for example, I spoke to students who attended a British university in Qatar. I spoke to students who attended an American university in Kazakhstan.
Overseas.
Yeah, so these are branch campuses. So the universities opened a campus in that country. So that's who I was interviewing. So Who would like to do that for their research?
Sarah, can I just ask
Yeah.
a question related to that?
Yeah.
Do you have like a recommendation in terms of the proportionality of each section? Because listening to your presentation here, I can think of ways in which, for example, your methodology alone could be an article.
Yes. Yeah, so this is going to be, what I would recommend is, where is your specific research contributing to the field? And that should be the longer section, because that's where you're getting into the originality, that's where you're getting into the contribution. So you may be making an original theoretical argument, at which point you really need to break that up into theoretical parts. So I have written both ways, where my findings were the primary thing, because nobody's been interviewing international students. And so just being able to say, here are these students, here are their voices, here's what they have to say. Like, okay, we know why, countries say they want branch campuses, we know why universities say they go overseas, but what do the students say? So I've written one of that. And then I'm trying to look at one about where I'm arguing for the use of narrative research, narrative methodology, narrative interviews as a method in order to understand people's motivations, and using my research as a case study. And so that one, the methodology is the bigger section. So it depends on your purpose. There's no magic ratio.
But I think sometimes one assumes that when you write an article, the larger section should be the findings and the discussion.
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily the case.
No, not necessarily. It depends on where your contribution is. Where's that contribution? Now, for example, if you're doing novel theory, so you're contributing to theory, you're still going to have to use that theory in your findings to analyze your findings. So you can't have a short findings. But you need to be aware of, where's my attention? You don't want to spend all your time talking about your methodology if you're doing something that people constantly do in your field, where if that's not what's original. You still need to explain it and why you're doing it, but you don't need to go into much depth. Thank you, that's a good point.
Just want to ask about literature review and theory. How to avoid plagiarism in this section?
So this is going to be a very short answer to a very difficult problem. So keep that in mind. So the first thing I would say is, when you're reading theory, or when you're reading the literature, and you're taking notes, read a page, a chapter, or whatever, close it, put it to the side, and write what you remember in your notes. So you're using your words to write down the notes. And then in your notes, keep track. These notes are from this book. These notes are from this journal. So you always remember where the notes come from. And then if there's a quote that you really like that you want to keep in your notes, write it with the quotation marks so that you know it comes from them. But the key is read it and put it away so you don't use their words. Sound good? Yeah, I do want to get one of you to walk through this for me. Who's going to volunteer to walk through this for me? So answer these questions. Yes, thank you. Go for it.
Regarding the introduction questions, simply my debate is this research focus on the representation of women in the media. How women are represented in the media. So the second question, what is the argument? My claim is the media sometimes exaggerates stereotypical image of women and their secondary role in the society through TV, movies, and advertising. So that's my claim. My assumption is based on, for example, on these questions. Why women is represented as a weak person, or illiterate, inexperienced, for example, maybe she's at work, or even as a goofy person, or anything else like that. So my assumption is about that. So my debate is on that question. My literature review, actually we have in media some theory about media effect. The most theories are talking This one is magic bullet theory. So I'm going to test if that effect on the public is just like a magic bullet on their mind, or how women are imagined or portrayed on the public's mind. The methodology, I'm going to test these things through survey. I'm going to ask people how's the influence, and then observation. Actually, I have a long experience in observing media, especially media, movies and advertising. And the other one, my second one is content analysis. I am going to select about 2 movies, for example, one local movie and the other one made in Turkey. It's more popular here, Turkey series. So I'm going to test what that is going to. And the other one is finding and discussion. I have a question here. Should I say in the abstract, for example, like that, what I put in here, spread the image that are harmful to women's dignity lead to reduce their ability. This can lead to gender-based discrimination and hinder gender equality. For example, this can be a conclusion, or can I say something before I finish the research?
So are you writing, so you haven't concluded the research?
Yeah,
You want to-
what's in mind is,
Yeah.
it's like that. It's like
So
that.
I would say at this moment it's your, the term that I was taught to use is hunch. So this is what you're guessing the answer is.
Yes, I am guessing.
Yeah. So the idea is, and it's fine, and you should, because you're academics, you've studied the field. It's normal that you have a hunch, but going back to those critical thinking points, be open to being wrong. So
Yeah.
when you do get the data and analyze it, if it doesn't match your conclusion, then okay, then what does it match? Then what does it say? So be willing to be wrong. And as long as you have that attitude, it's okay.
As I said at the beginning, the first one, the debate, I didn't select anything. Is it whether it's good or bad or anything else? I just say the representation of women in the media.
Yeah.
So how it's represented.
Yeah, and I think that's to avoid, you should always avoid the argument of good or bad, because good or bad is in the eye of the beholder,
Yeah.
right?
Positive or negative.
Exactly, like it depends who you talk to if that's good or bad, right? So take more of a sort of analytical eye of, okay, rather than saying it's good or bad, what is that representation, and what are the implications of that perception or that view, right? So rather than saying, oh, it's a bad whatever, this is how women are viewed, and this is the implications of women being represented this way. And so anyone reading that hopefully will go, ooh, that's a shame, but you should never be the one telling us it's bad. Cool. So do you guys see how that works? How you start to have a structure. And if you follow this, then all you're doing is adding the details as you go through. And then you can also use this to read your articles after you've written them to make sure you've answered these questions as you've gone through. So use this for both writing it, but then editing it afterwards. Yes?
I just have a question about finding a discussion and conclusion. Some journals, they accepting in the article the discussion and conclusion in one partition. So does that will affect on the structure of the article or?
Yeah, so think of it this way. So the findings and discussions is actually a very hairy thing, because depending on your field, some people like the findings completely separate from the discussion, so they just want the representation of the data, the overall data and what you found, and then the analyzing to be a separate part. Others want the analyzing, so the discussion part, to lead into conclusions, but you still need a conclusionary paragraph after that. So think of discussions as including conclusions, but then you need a conclusion, if you will. Yes?
Can we use these steps as a template for before finishing the papers, with the abstract to apply for the journals? And I mean,
like,
to get the acceptance from these journals, and then we will follow the steps to finish the paper.
so if you think about the question how, what is it, what, how, and why, this is just more details on the how, what, and why. You'll notice most of these questions are what, how, why. I mean, there's a couple where they don't have how, but you see. So basically, you can use this to then create your abstract, if you will, to shorten into your abstract.
No, I mean, we can use it as a template. For example, for the introduction, I can put some paragraphs, and then I'll apply for the journal. When I get the feedback from them, and then I'll finish my paper.
That's not how it works.
Yeah,
The whole
let's
thing needs to
say.
go first.
You've got to have the whole thing. You submit the whole thing.
Because some journals, they have call papers, and sometimes we just send abstracts, and then they have invoices, and they say,
That's slightly different. Usually, if you're like just applying for a journal such as this, you know, we want the whole journal, we want the
Yeah.
whole article, okay? But I appreciate you're right, you get advertisements for call for papers, in which case you can just send an abstract, and then, you know, if they want it, then you have the whole thing. So they're two different things.
So, but a note on that. So I've done that before, where it was a book chapter, and so they did a call for abstracts to choose what the chapters would be, and then they asked for the full chapter. Now, the key with that is, if you haven't already begun writing the chapter or the article, is making sure your abstract will match the final article, because they're choosing it based on. So if your final article doesn't match the abstract you sent in, they can still reject you. So if you're doing that, be very confident that what you write in that abstract will be reflected in the journal. So you don't have the ability to change the abstract.
and do you think for the abstract it's better to put the main findings as well?
You should have
Situations?
you should have your argument, which your argument is based on your findings. Your arguments better be based on your findings. Yeah.
If I can add just something to that. In terms of your findings, personally, I prefer that the findings are phrased in such a way that it's still open-ended. The worst thing I can possibly think of is if you have an abstract that is absolutely definitive. This is definitely it. I'm afraid it's not. That's why we're in the business we're in, to discuss things. You know, go further. So phrase it in such a way that, you know, okay, I found this, but it's not necessarily the end of the story.
Yeah.
We need some consideration about the recommendation. Should we write the recommendation?
It depends.
It needs some analysis.
So yeah, well, okay, so if you have to write recommendations, well, it first of all depends. Are you making, you know, there's so many different types of recommendations out there, right? And you know, especially in the world of academia, I think sometimes people have the instinct to write practical implications or recommendations, but actually think about academically what the recommendations are. What are you saying about the field, about the study of the field?
Also should be related to my main body of the thesis or research. Of course, I agree with you. Well, what should be right? How the style.
Is it essential that you write recommendations?
No. You don't need to. You don't need to have recommendations.
Sometimes I need
Yeah.
also you my what I'm thinking, what I wish as a conclusion.
Well, it seems to me what may take you completely the wrong way. What I think you're saying is that your recommendations should be your conclusions.
Yeah.
So what would you find are your suggestions for maybe research or way
Yeah.
that's
That's the so what question. That's the so what. So in your conclusions, you include a so what. So it's yeah. So okay. So we have a question about the recommendations right now. I sort of want to open this up. So the idea of recommendations, it should be something that, first of all, yes, it comes from your board, but it's about what does this mean going forward? So you're not necessarily giving a list of specific things people need to do, but overall, where does this take us? Like, what is the next step for the field? What is the next step for future researchers? But it's not necessarily a list of first we need to do this, then we do this, but rather broader. What are the broader implications? Yeah, but it's good to think of it not as a list of recommendations, because when you write a policy paper, you do a list of recommendations. But for an academic journal, you don't do a list of recommendations. You consider the implications. So it's different. It should be based squarely within the academic field.
So if I can add just one more thing to that, I think something that's quite useful to link your conclusion back to your why question in the introduction. Why is it important? That's your question. And so you've answered that. You've answered that in your conclusion in the way that you've raised your recommendation.
Yes.
Actually, I'm wondering about there are any journal request a specific type of abstract for submission or?
We're back into the world of abstracts. Do you want to take this? So journals having specific. So what I would recommend is when you look at a journal, look at the abstracts from that journal, because that will tell you the style that that journal tends to prefer. So don't expect like I want this type of abstract and getting a full description. They normally don't do that, but if you read just even a couple abstracts from that journal, you start to learn what that journal wants. And be thinking about those questions. So how is the how, why, and what answered in these abstracts? And mimic that style. So do it in the style of that journal. But they're not going to tell you specifically, oh, there's this abstract that I want it this way. They don't normally tell you. So just read the abstracts from that journal and analyze them in the way that Lloyd was telling you. And write it in the same style.
We have time, like later, to talk about reviewers' commentary.
Reviewers come, we can. Right. And we'll talk about full methodologies tomorrow. And we're going to talk a little bit about ethics, because ethics and data collection are really linked, and ethics are a big issue in terms of how, especially if you're doing research that involves people. Ethics is a big deal. So, in terms of your data, your question determines the data you need, right? So, not all questions can be answered by any kind of data. So your question determines, and your answer, I guess, determines the kind of data you need. So there is no magic what kind of data is better. It depends on your question. And your question will dictate that. So that's something to really keep in mind as you're doing your research. Don't look for, in my field, what's the best form of data, but actually, for my question, what is the best kind of data? So what type of data will answer my question? So, we'll go back to my question. So how do students navigate the complex web of competing interests at transnational, so branch campuses? Are they even aware? So, I've got two questions on there, so you tell me. I mean, I've already hinted at it in the last session. So what kind of data do I need to answer this question? Yes?
A questionnaire.
A questionnaire. Okay, so that's a collection, that's a way of collecting data, but what is it collecting?
Opinions of students.
Okay, there we go. So I need the opinions or the perspectives of students. So interviews can do it, questionnaires can do it.
Focus group.
Tests, focus groups. And focus groups and interviews are different. Like there are different reasons for doing them, right?
Like opinion for stakeholders.
Okay, so maybe talking to other stakeholders and seeing what they have to say. So who speaks for the students?
And statics for the number of students in that section.
Okay, so maybe we want to look at some statistics, just like a background on the amount of students we're talking about here, or what their backgrounds are. Absolutely. And usually, even if you are doing interviews, you always want some sort of data about who you're talking about. So for example, if you're doing interviews, you might want to include, depending on what you're doing, the gender of the person, or the age of the person, or, you know, the person's background, right? It depends on why you're interviewing them, but you'll always need some sort of something on them. Look at that. You guys are on it. I mean, look at that. You hit it. On the nose. My suggestions. So there's my question. So how do students navigate the complex web of competing interests? Okay, so what do I need? I need the students' reasons, right? So their opinions. Why did they choose to come here? I need the students' experiences, so not just their opinions or their reasons for coming, but what has it been like to study, right? And then finally, I need their thoughts on what they studied and on their teachers. So, what was your experience of studying? Oh, I struggled so much. I couldn't understand what they were asking me to do. They kept talking about critical thinking. Why were they talking to me about, right? So, their experiences, but also then what they thought of it. So, what do you think of this syllabus? What did you think of this reading list? Was it a good reading list? Did it make you think about the subject? What did you think of your teachers? Are they different than other teachers you've had? Is this education different? And then also the administration. What was the administration of the university like? Was it different than other universities or other schools you've been to, right? So that's what I need. And then the means of collection, you guys hit it on the head. First one I have up there, focus groups, right? Second one I have there, individual interviews. And the third one, surveys, so questionnaires. Look at that. You can do my research for me, right? Now, the key here from this point on is the next two sections. So the strength of the method and the challenges or limitations, because that's what's going to make you decide, right? Because all of these are justifiable. All of these on a practical front are fine. Now, what do you get? Why are they different? What makes them different? Well, a focus group, you get a collective story of what students think. So when you interview 4 or 5 people together, you get the story of all 5 of them together. You don't get to see what's different, or you don't get to see the things they struggled with because they're not going to share it. So you get one story, a collective story, which may be good. Like maybe that's what you want, is to understand the shared story. But the limitation is any disagreement or any differences in experiences might not show up as data. They may not tell us. So that's a weakness. For interviews, you get the individual's story. So what each individual thinks about why they went to the university, what their experience was, and what they thought of what they studied, right? So you get individual stories, and so you get to see maybe where there are differences in the stories. But it takes a whole lot more time. Because if you think about like 10 participants, you interview 10 people. If you do a focus group, you can have 2 focus groups of 5, nice and easy, 2 to 3 hours, wash your hands, you're done. That's 10 hours, right? And that, depending on your workload, depending on how quickly you need to write the work, depending on the institution, you might not have that time. So a clear limitation is time. And then surveys, the strength of a survey is the amount of results you can get. You can send it off to all these different universities, and you can send it to all these different people, and they'll send it to other people, and you can get hundreds of results. So you can get really large-scale data from a survey. But the answers are superficial. Because when you're in an interview, you can always go, oh, tell me the story, or tell me more about that, or, and why did you think that? You can always ask more questions to get a deeper story. Whereas a survey, you don't have that chance. You're just going to get the superficial. So do you see how what starts off with, yes, this is the data I need, this is how I can get it. Now I can make a decision as to what the best method is. So in my case, because I don't care about my own time, I chose the interviews. Because I wanted to not only find out overall what the experience was, but I wanted to see if there were differences in experience. So that's why I chose it. Yes?
I think regarding to the last one, the survey, sometimes we will get inaccurate data.
Yes?
That's a big problem. Sometimes when you send a survey to someone
he or she will not care just answer.
So it's just very flat data. It's very, very, very superficial, and they write it quickly. Sometimes if you have an open question and they have to answer it, they answer with 2 words and you're not sure what they mean. Like the surveys are great when you want lots of something, but don't expect depth.
I mean, the survey, you have to design it that way, what you get from the end. So it should be easy and not make them to write down. Just close question.
So you'll never get why, and you'll never get stories with the survey. Which sometimes you don't need stories. Sometimes all you want are the yes or no's, which is fine, or the rates, so the Likert scale. So between 1 to 5, how would you rate? And that's good, not for this, because the kind of data I need won't work for a survey.
Yes. Sorry. I mean, and that's also depending on the field as well.
Yes.
There's this debate between qualitative, quantitative,
Yes.
Quantitative people believe in having more people, more sample, while qualitative say, well, 2 people is better than 100 without, depth.
And that too is shaped by your question. Wow.
That's true.
Because I think somebody who would want a lot of answers wouldn't ask the question the same way I did. So I'm looking at a navigation of competing interests. I'm asking for the moments of conflict. So I would never use a survey for that. Like, I would never go quantitative. If I wanted the quantitative answer, my question would be slightly different. So that your question says a lot.
For the focus group, the reputation maybe for the challenge is there are some people, they might lead the conversations, but the leader group will have to focus a lot of those discussions.
Yep.
Because maybe that people will gather all the ideas and don't lead the discussion.
Yeah. So as a researcher, you have to be very good at coordinating a focus group to ensure that everyone shares. So you have to be very good at recognizing who's not speaking and being able to tell the person who speaks a lot, thank you, that's very good. However, I want to hear from someone else, and being able to silence them without them being offended, because you want them to still share.
Sure.
So focus groups does require, as a skill, quite a bit of managing people.
And the focus group, I think, do you think that needs another word, focus group discussions?
Well, it's called focus groups. Like that's how
Because
people refer.
there are some other focus groups, just like the some people who observing those people, for example, for abstract science.
Yes.
But for social science, I think it's focus group discussion.
Yeah, they tend to be discussion oriented. So you're discussing a series of questions, or you might have them do a task together. But the point is to hear what they're saying while they do the task. So I've done focus groups where I've asked students to design their perfect university. I don't care what they write. What I care about is what they're saying to each other while they're trying to design the perfect university, right? So it's still the discussion that's the focus. Yeah.
I was wondering why you didn't list the previous studies in this list, which we might be heavily relying on.
So at this point, I'm just focusing on the data collection, right?
It's a part of data.
Yeah, sure. So I'm focusing really on this specific question and what I was doing. Now so in this case, I know that there's no studies that have looked at this yet. So there's nothing for me to look at previous literature for. But that's because I know because I've done the research.
Talking in general.
Yeah, but in general. So this is an example from my work. This is specifically my question. So I'm using my question as an example. Your question might require that. Especially if you're in history.
Yes.
In history, archival material, literature is central. That would be one of your data collection. What data types, definitely. It's just, this is an example from my research. So I'm using just this so you can see how it works. So.
Just a basic question.
Yeah. It's the same slide, yeah.
If we take a questionnaire with Sue, and you are going to conduct your paper, say at Kazakhstan or in Qatar, and you are willing to speak language, should your forms be validated first? Validation of the questionnaire from the outset, beforehand,
So you're talking about questionnaires, you're talking about surveys specifically. So with surveys, I would say, what do you mean by validated?
Like, you have a form in English, right? And you want to target someone else who does not speak English. You will be converting that form of questionnaire into their language. By converting it, should you first validate the questionnaire? Is it correct or not? Consistent or not?
Well, here's the question is, so normally when people are doing this, you want the person who's translating it to be a native speaker of the final language. Right?
Yes.
Yeah. So, but after, so once again, it's this notion of, if you're the one who designed the survey, so if I design the survey and then I change it, so I'm going to say Portuguese because that's the language that is my native language, right? I don't need to validate that because I designed the first one and I've designed the second one. It's all still mine. So the validation might only come into play if you've given it to someone else to translate. But if it's your survey to begin with, and then you translate it yourself, I mean, unless your concern is that it's not well translated, but then that's because it's not your language, and then you're giving it to someone whose language they understand. But it's
checking out the translation. The validation of the form doesn't affect the recognition of the form in terms of thoughts. That is the validation. Should or we should, I mean, we can skip this or we cannot.
Can I explain something?
yeah, so not.
This is pretty much related to the context here. It's
Okay.
required if you do a PhD, for example, you do any research. After you design your questionnaire, but you put a questions with 3 other columns, to what extent you agree with those questions. It's not about language at all. Am I right?
No.
So it's not about language, it's about validating the question.
Oh, so you mean survey design?
Before you go with the final version of your
Yes, so you design the survey.
Yes, but before going to the final version, you test your question.
Oh, you pilot. Yeah, you should always pilot. Yes.
It's not with piloting. It's you do it experts. Usually they call it validity and reliability.
Well, I mean, if you're a doctoral student,
Am I right?
so my questions always went through my doctoral supervisor, and my supervisor
So you do it
verified.
with one person, but here you have to interview, you have to send to 30
Just to
people.
test
Okay.
the data.
That's a contextual issue.
Pilot
That's-
study maybe.
Yeah, because that's not a, I cannot imagine sending my interview questions out to 30 people to validate.
Just to test your data before.
Yeah, so we do data testing where we pilot the survey, but that's not with experts, but you send it to a small group to just see if you're getting the answers you want. Like the type of answer.
Here, it's required to do it, send it to experts.
Okay, but that's here, that's not elsewhere, that's here. Yeah. So I can't answer that because that's about this context. But in other contexts, no. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's not, no. I mean, always give feedback, but not in that sort of formal way. All right, so what I want you to do now, so we've talked about data collection, we've used mine as an example. So what I want you to do now is write down the types of data, the actual data you need to answer your question. So if we go back to mine, the type of data I needed was students' reasons for studying, students' experiences, and students' thoughts, right? So what type of, wrong way. So what type, well, like what data do you need, and then how do you get that data? So what are the ways you can get that data? What are all the ways you can get that data? And chances are you've already thought about this because you've already been working on your research, right? And so think about the strengths and weaknesses, and really think about how you justify your choice of data collection, because that's what this is about. Everything is about why. And as long as you can say why, you're good. So it's all about the justification. So think about all the different ways you might be able to get the data. What are the strengths and weaknesses? And then which one did you use? And why is that one the one that has the most strengths? So individually, go through that. Take it away. Yes, I have a, I come back to this. With this, I just want to take the previous one? You've had a chance to think about, well, actually, let's go back to that slide. All right, so who would like to talk about, so in light of your question, so what data do you need, and how can you collect it, and which one do you think is the best one? So who would like to share? I see one hand went up over here. Yep, go ahead.
We can't hear.
Oh, yeah.
When I got their answers, I'm going to make a visualization of these answers. Why? Because I'm after something.
Okay, what are you after?
Yes, I adopted someone called Baker. She proposed something called translation beyond the citation.
Okay.
And we are talking about these expressions. We said that such expressions carry something ideological. So I cannot translate them literally or at the level of the sentence, word by word. So there must be a model to translate them beyond the citation level. Baker proposed that either to be defined, for example, a cultural equivalent for these expressions, if that fits directly to the target language. If something is said in Arabic, there must be something, or there must be a counterpart that carries the same or exact meaning and the same effect for the English reader.
Yes.
One. If not, there is what's called paraphrasing.
Yes.
In order to cannot find this, we are going to lean on paraphrasing in order to carry just the meaning for the reader. So I have these two strategies. I'm going to select the stages to see what the students they did with reference to these two strategies. The others, they did not follow, I have to put them again, add additional column, for example, for literal translation. And I am expecting that they will do so.
Yes.
Because I put in my mind that they lack cultural experience. And they weren't able to do it acceptably and correctly. This is for these.
So what other ways could you have done it that you're not doing? So you're doing a test, and then you're analyzing the test using these specific ways. So looking for paraphrasing, looking for the cultural, right? So what other ways could you have done the data that you're not going to? So what are the alternatives that you've dismissed? Or is that the only way to look at this data?
Because I fixed my model that I'm going to follow. There are some other figures who propose something. I'm just going to add them to my literature review.
Because the key here is to get you really thinking, okay, I'm doing it this way, but there's a reason why I'm doing it this way.
Yes.
And there are other reasons that I'm not doing it, right? So so the idea is, first of all, to get you to imagine other ways, and then to figure out why you're not doing that. So you've done a really good job of justifying why you are doing what you're doing, but why not others? Like, what are the others?
Because after creating scientific, there's something called cultural implications in your translation. The student, when he's going to translate, I'm going to see, did he take into his consideration these elements, as I said? So it will be clear from his...
So the test really makes it very obvious what's there. Okay. All right. Do you see what I'm going for here? Like what I'm really trying to get you to do is to really sort of, I know you know the research you did, but what I want you to really be thinking about is why this and why not something else? Like, and to be able to vocalize that why this over something else. So once again, going back to that critical thinking sort of notion of being able to really justify why you made those choices. Yeah. Does someone else want to share? Yes, that was.
If I be honest with you, if I have the time and money, I will choose the interview and focus group. But if I haven't enough money and I haven't any time, because for example, my research field is in the city of Halabja. Halabja is far away from my area, okay, from my city. So I will be doing the questionnaire and send it by email, and I will put it on the Google, and they give me the answer.
Okay. So so this is where now we get into the difference between practical issues and non-practical issues. Now, and we'll talk about this when we talk about methodology in general. Tomorrow, we will talk about the sort of what I call the practical issues. There's a whole bunch of other issues, but one of them is practical. It's sort of me pulling on what chooses. Okay, so you have a practical issue here. It's too expensive and too difficult to get this. All right, so now, how do you justify that in terms of a type of data that's good?
In terms of, I know in terms of practicality, sometimes limitation you declare because of convenience sampling, even something
Yes.
it has even a name. You have chosen this because of convenience. You declare it so that anyone read it, understand these how the circumstances around the data collection, and limitation section is normally the place to put that.
Exactly, so as part of your methods, you always have somewhere where you talk about the limits of your method, so hence the strengths and weaknesses. So even if you have, this one really is the best one, it's still going to have limitations. So you include that in there, but you frame it within the notions of limitations. And you don't say, oh, I don't have money, right? But you do say the costs of being able to implement or, whatever it is specifically. And then from there you go into, however, the strengths of surveying is that I get these things from them. And access to your participants is a great reason to choose one type of data over another. So, and that's fine. It's just about honestly thinking about it and then thinking about how do you write that.
For your plan, I think it's better to think about the sample. If it is accessible or it is easy to do or cost to manage. So it affects your result.
Yes.
First one, and you have to plan.
Yeah.
Two days you have to choose.
Yes. So
I think it's totally justification.
Yeah. So you're sampling, like, okay, so for example, I wanted to do interviews. And so I did interviews with master's students in Qatar and first-year undergraduate students in Kazakhstan. Was it because I wanted very different experiences? That's what I said I wanted. But in reality, it was who I had access to. Right? And that's okay. Access is a huge thing. That's fine to acknowledge, right? That access to participants is part of the reason you make your choices.
How about online interview?
Skype? Yeah.
You do all the interviews online?
Yeah, of course you can. Of course you can. Yeah. So yeah, you can do Skype interviews. Yes. Absolutely.
Since you have got the justification.
As long as you got the justification. That's the key, is why. If you can answer why, you're fine.
To go first.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, before data collection, I think the main point is the data quality. How you can make a guarantee for your data quality. For example, it's your question or questionnaire, interview guide, quality guide, any question to be more leads. For example, I sent a question for the Johns Hopkins University. What is the negative impact of child marriage? She said that's a little bit lead because it's better to be edited to what is the consequences. Is it bad or no? That's not your point of view. This one, and using online or GPS, using MAPI program, tablets. For example, I know how many minutes for conducting interview, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, when connected with the internet, for example, using tablet or MAPI. And the second one is the sample size. Is it representative or not? How are you skilled for conducting focus group discussion, communication skills that you need to use? and using mixed methods, both quality and quantity to complete each other's in line. For example, for data collection, we need for quantitative data, we used questionnaire for data collection or the information.
Depends on your question.
And for analyzing, I think it's better, I'm talking about my specialty, to use the qualitative method to answer the why question for the stakeholders.
Yeah, so here's the, and you hit the nail on the head. So it's very rare, not impossible, but very rare that a why question can be answered with just quantitative data. Just. Right? So you have to think, what is my question asking? Because a lot of people talk about mixed methods as the wonderful solution to, you know, what research should look like. But actually some questions are not conducive to numbers, to qualitative, to quantitative things. Sometimes you really need the qualitative and vice versa. So my question, so if we go back, is really qualitative. There's very little data, statistical data I could use to answer how students navigate. I can't imagine, right? So that question, just by the nature of the question, makes me have to go qualitative. Other questions will be the complete reverse, where the nature of the question is you have to do a statistical analysis. There's just no choice because that's the question. And so it's about really looking at that question and saying, what data answers this, right? So if you're looking at, for example, so some of the research I've been doing at my university is looking at how well different students do in their studies. That I can do statistically, and I do. I just look at final marks, and I compare them according to different types of students, and different ethnicities and different genders, right? Very easy to do statistically, because that was my question. Same field, same education, but it's just a different question. So really pay attention to your question and what answers this question. What I'm going to do is, there's been a request for a photo. So before I move into ethics, which is going to be a very difficult conversation, because if data is dependent, ethics is even more. So before we go into that, I figure we do a fun thing and take a photograph together, and then we'll come back and do ethics and finish the day. Sound good?
Yes.
Ethics.
I think there's sometimes situations of the field, for example, the field of judgment, or data collection, and all of these methods.
Yeah.
For example, we talk about the medicine, or rather than medicine, what about medicine, we have to have very accurate data. So, when I ask about certain disease, healthcare problem, it's better to have face-to-face.
Yes. Yeah, because it's, and that's getting into the ethics of it, because it's a sensitive topic. You don't want to just have a piece of paper, you want to see them.
You know, for example, like, I would like to share my professional information online. So I'm just going to make
But it's all, so what you have to do is sort of that, apply that critical force to what are you doing? What is normal in life? What's the best way to do it in life, on time, on field, and why? And the key is that why. And if you can show that why, that's what
it's like big difference between, you know, the translate research.
what we view our responsibilities as researchers are. Because there's the policy side, and in UK universities you have a very strict policy. My understanding here, there isn't much of a policy, right? But there's also then, what kind of researcher do you want to be? And that's deeply implicated in ethics. So I started off with this quote because it sort of hits why ethics matter, especially in terms of you getting published. So editors, hi, our editor.
Messenger.
Just the messenger. So editors and publishers are accountable to the public along with researchers, so you guys, to ensure all aspects of the research process and disseminations of findings, so publications, are transparent, honest, and trustworthy. Research ethics and guidelines promote moral and social value, protecting human subject safety, we're responsible for that, as well as their health, and to ensure that the public can trust the quality and integrity of the research. So part of you being published in international journals is speaking to this. So regardless of what your university policies are in terms of ethical review, if you want to be published internationally, this is what we're looking at. Now the problem with this is it's very vague and very big. What does it mean to be honest and trustworthy in your research? What does it mean to protect subject safety? Are we talking about just physical safety? Or are we also talking about safety from being fired? Right? So if you interview somebody and they say something critical maybe about where they work, will they lose their job if people find out who that person is? Right? So when we talk about subject safety, it's not just physical safety. It's employment safety, it's education safety. So if you're interviewing students about what they think of a university, and they say something very negative about it, I need to make sure that they don't lose their place at the university because of what they've said to me. Right? So my responsibility, regardless of the ethical code, is to protect them. And so how do I protect them, but still get my research? So that's sort of where we're going into now. And it's a bit vague. So I have another quote. Oh, it's not. I can just move. That's all right. All right, so this is a little bit more broken down. So privacy, anonymity, diversity and dignity of individuals and communities should be respected.
So you said anonymity.
Anonymity. Oh, autonomy, sorry, thank you. I'm getting ahead of myself. Autonomy. So, right, so you need to respect privacy, autonomy, so their right to choose, their right to be. The diversity, so communities are diverse, and you need to respect that. We're very aware. So respect for who you're interviewing, respect for who you're researching. All social sciences and humanities researchers should acknowledge their social responsibilities. So what you write, what you publish, there is responsibility here. And then should be maximizing benefit and minimizing harm. And I think it's that minimizing harm that we really need to be thinking about. By doing this research, are we causing harm? Who are we causing harm to? And how do we minimize that? So, I have a case study here. So we have a researcher is interviewing minority ethnic individuals in a series of small communities to understand their lived experiences of racism and discrimination. A very sensitive topic, right? So the researcher changes all the names of the participants, which is normal by ethical protocols, so not using their real names. However, some of the communities are very small. And when coupled with other contextual data, so gender, age, whatever, it is possible, not guaranteed, but it might be possible for people in those communities to guess who was interviewed. So, and then if they're interviewed, they may face even more discrimination. So, what do? How do you still do this research and protect those people? So why don't you at your tables first discuss this, and then I'll take some answers. So, how do you do this research and still protect your participants? Go ahead. So at your tables, discuss, or with your groups. No, about this one. So looking at this one, how do you do this research? We'll get to your topic in a moment, but look at the case. How would you do this?
I think he's looking a bit more relieved. Stress is better.
It would help. Maybe you go to more communities. Or be more general about the location. So don't be specific. So say a region rather than a community. Or maybe you even say a country instead of saying a region, right? So that's what you start to do. You don't lie, you don't change the location, you make it a bigger location. Yes. So you see how you can do that. Exactly. Exactly. Yes. And so suddenly you're now, it's harder to find that. You've made the sample bigger. Like, but not the sample. Yeah, you could delete it. Or you could make age ranges. So instead of saying 45, you could say ages 30 to 50.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Do you see how you can make it? Yeah, and as you say, the reason I'm not going to is because love you because they actually that's something that they can do. So if you say that, they'll go, thank you. Yes, the respect is law. You always say that. Yes. Okay, so I've heard some interesting and very good answers to this, right? Because what seems like impossible actually becomes very possible once you start thinking about it. So I have heard some good things. So what came up? So how do you handle this? How do you publish this work?
One solution. Publish it Swahili. Nobody can read it.
But then you're not getting international journals, right? Okay, sure. So publish it in the language that no one can read.
Negative.
How else? There's actual real ways. Like, this is not an uncommon issue. So I'm in the Institute for International Inequalities. So it's very common for this issue to come up when you're researching inequalities. Very common, right? So how do you handle it? I know this group had wonderful answers. If you want to share.
That's why we don't say it.
Oh, you don't want to share your answers, I see.
Because you helped us.
All right, well, others, what did you come up with? Guys, hold on.
For us, I was just saying, because I'm working on research, I look at the age, I don't put as like they are 18, 19, I just put age range.
Yep.
They are between the age of 18 to 24, or you can say between the age of 20 to 30.
Yep. So in your contextual data, so in terms of like, so age thing, make it an age range. Absolutely. So suddenly we don't know that this person's 18. We just know that this person's from the age of 16 to 25. And then suddenly it's harder to figure out who it is. Okay, what are other things you could change? We'll go there and then to you. Go ahead.
We can add another contextual data, another character such a geographic location. So in that case, you are creating ambiguity about how to figure out which community they are.
Exactly. So instead of naming the communities, name the region. Or if that's still too specific, name the country. Right? So I interviewed people from 6 communities in Iraq. We don't know which community. So you see how you just start to widen the data a bit, the contextual data. And explain why you do that in your research. Say, the reason why I'm not naming specific communities, or I'm not saying the specific region, is in order to protect my participant's identity. You say that, no one is going to have a problem with you. They're going to be very happy with you, actually. The idea that you're protecting your participants is a good thing. So,
sorry, if you make a research among a minority group which are living in a specific region in the country, you cannot do that.
Well, yeah. I mean, so in this case, they were minorities within communities in this example. If you're looking at minorities in a region, once again, don't talk about the region, but don't get specific about which groups, like which cities you looked at or which, whatever you looked at. Because then, okay, yes, it's a region, but we're still not going to figure out who the individual is. Now, if you're worried that if you write about a minority group that there will be a government intervention, then you need to think about how do I write about this in a way that won't cause problems. Because in the end, you need to make sure you're not causing problems for those people. You do need to protect those people. Always. Always, always, always.
For some topic, we have actually a program. For example, ISIS constituents. So you should talk about ESCP. For those, for example, if I interview some girls, if it is important if it is, if I can ignore ages or maybe gender or something. Gender you cannot ignore.
Yes.
If I ignore ages, it's not affect my research. Maybe, or maybe if I widen my sample, not about 10 girls, maybe I can interview 25.
And that's something they said as well over here, is widen your sample.
Yeah.
Right? So if you're worried that your sample's too small, that you've made the parameters of your sample too small, widen your sample size, right? Because the larger the sample size is, the harder it is to find specific individuals. So if you can, if it's not too hard to do the research, widen your sample size. Yes, definitely.
Or ignore ages.
Or ignore ages. If ages, in the end, you know, sometimes they do matter, but it's more important to protect the individuals than it is to have the perfect data. So if you need to, ignore the ages. Yeah. But what you're doing is figuring out how to anonymize beyond just the name. You're anonymizing in a wider sense.
Qualitative methods sometimes helps, particularly when you skip all those demographic characters, specifications, and everything will be fine. And the easiest one is to just not do it at the beginning. Just
not do it at the beginning?
Not do the research at the beginning.
Yeah. And ideally, you think about your ethical issues before you conduct the research.
Yes, this should
So
be verified
before. Always do this thinking before you do the research, because if you reach a point where you go, I can't do this without protecting it, then you haven't wasted your time actually collecting the data, right? So yes, do your ethical thinking beforehand.
One thing, I think probably this is, sometimes I probably made some comments from your perspective. There is no, although there are some very high quality universities, local private universities, they follow some research guidelines. The rest, if you go interview people and you even show that after a week that he will be or she will be killed, that's fine, no one can stop you. So research committees, or research ethics committees are not working on just this for your information.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, Iraqi universities, KRG universities should go and step into that and put some regulations to not let everyone under the name of a researcher go and interview people and put them to the risk. But not only a risk, sometimes it's about trauma, whether you are allowed to
relive
interview people, remind, recalling all those trauma, particularly in the case of, for example, some days after ISIS or some other cases as well. To an extent we can. So research ethics. Sorry, this is your...
No, you're absolutely right. And you make a good point that goes back to that notion of human safety. It's human psychological safety as well. Exactly. So when we think about safety, it's not just physical safety, though that's really important. It's all forms of safety, of well-being, right? So yeah, in the UK we have ethical committees. So anytime I want to do a new piece of research that involves humans, so either in interviews, but even if I'm just collecting their statistical data and analyzing it, I still need permission. You send it to a committee, and the committee will review it to see if it's ethical. I know that's not common here.
No, we have it.
You do have it?
Yeah. I said in some universities, yes, but generally...
But we cannot enter any institution unless you have a formal document that you are interviewing people.
But this is, do you mean the ASAISH?
No, every institution. I did in finance, I did in parliament, I did in few other ministries. I have papers for all of them, from my foreign university and from local one.
Okay.
Then they allowed me to interview the people.
Okay, but this is not after what? Being through a research ethics committee.
Yeah.
This is something totally different. I'm not saying about the support letter you get, usually you do it. When you go to otherwise they don't let you to enter that building.
No, but doctor, we have one thing. For instance, I did on Yazidi community, and my research was the Islamic State assault on the Yazidi community, enslaving women as a case. So I had interviewed 100 Iraqis. So I said the 100 Iraqis are interviewed from all over Iraq, in the country and outside. So I did this because we have a lot of people abroad. But then the ethical committee of my foreign university, and here too, they had few things that they forced me to take out. For instance, Islam doesn't allow enslaving women. So there was things that I put, but they made me to
to check that is they say that it's a sum of religion or ethics or like ethnicity. So there's things that you can do. For instance, my PhD partner, the girl that she was with me, she did one dissertation, and that was at the very last stage that she couldn't withdraw because it was the last year. And her case was comparing Germany, Hungary, and Sweden. And it was migration, rules against migration. But Hungarian government intervened and they said that you have to change the findings. And in fact, the findings were according to what the Hungarian professors wanted, not what the Germans and the Swedish one wanted. So sometimes you are forced to do changes as researcher that you might not want, but there are ways that you can escape, like I did, for instance, made it Iraqis inside and outside, Jewish people, Islam, and I mixed all of them. So sometimes you can make changes, but there are certain cases that even critical committee would not allow you to do.
And so there's the committee side of things, but then there's the what kind of researcher do you want to be right? And so a lot of this is deciding for yourself, okay, I want to publish internationally, I know ethics matters, so I need to demonstrate that I've taken this into consideration. But it's also, what do you want to be? Do you want to, what kind of research do you want to do? What kind of line do you want to stand on? So where are your ethics, in other words? What are your views? So what's the point that's too much harm for you? So a lot of these questions are a little bit about also, okay, here's what the standard is, but do I want to be just the standard, or do I want to stand a little bit higher? And no one can make that choice but you. Related to ethics, and we're sort of getting into this, are these two concepts: agency and reflexivity. So agency is the capacity of individuals to act individually and to make their choices. So the people whose research, who are the subjects of your research, right? Either through interviews or even, once again, statistical data. If you're collecting statistical data on people, those are people, right? They have agency. They have, hopefully, the right to speak for themselves. And so when you do research, are you taking that right away from them, or are you respecting that right? And all ethics comes back to that, right? So even in our previous example, we wanted to respect what they said while protecting them. So we didn't want to lie about what they said, because that's one way to protect them. No, because they said something. So how do we respect what they said and still protect them? So one is agency. Are you respecting the agency of your participants? And then from that, how do you do that? Well, you do that by questioning yourself. So thinking about yourself and questioning yourself in relation to your participants, to see how you are viewing them, to make sure you don't misrepresent them. So it's that. So for example, if you're even reading interview data, are you misinterpreting what they said? That's an ethical question. When I write this journal article, am I representing what they said or what they did or who they are? Or have I changed that because it suits my argument better? So that's an ethical question. So all these ethical questions come back to these two things: respecting who they are, and then making sure that when you write it up, you are still doing that, and questioning yourself about that. So we've got 15 minutes. I was also going to do something about ownership of data, which I can do, but I want to make sure that in your groups, looking at your research, so talk to each other about your research, what are the possible ethical issues you might have? What possible, doesn't mean you will have them, but you might have. Yes?
I have a question about agency. And what if their answer of the participant might harm another community? So how I can avoid this harm for another community? How I can balance between that?
Yeah. So at that point you have to say you can either not include them at all. So you're not changing what they said, or whatever, but you're not including it because it'll cause harm. Or how can you present it in a way that it's very clear that this is a participant's view and it should not be accurate, if you will. So it's that balance. It depends, of course, what you said. It depends on what you have. So one end is just don't include it. If what one person says is going to it comes to cause harm. Don't even sit.
So is it possible that I am suggesting something, asking for them, just to try to create balancing in the answers? So in that case, to protect the other communities from any harm, like that. Is it possible that I suggest some answers for them? Or that's evolving too much? And
You could be viewed as leading the discussion, right? You can ask certain questions, see if they will say something else that would lead them away from that. But otherwise, I'd be very careful about conversation and conversation. So agency, so the person's agency, so you and I give an agency. So what that means is we have the ability to speak for ourselves and to do what we do, right? So we all have an agency. So your job as a researcher is to respect the agency of the people. How are you respecting? So when you write your research, are you trying to speak for them, or are you letting them speak for themselves? And it's very difficult. So you respect them. Yeah, as a group and as which is why I'm sort of putting it on you as individual researchers, which is difficult, but it has to start somewhere. And so if we don't have the sort of IRB system, then all right, well, it's for yourself. What is your it's not just So I used to work in Pakistan and I did lots of research and there were I'm sure. Whenever I that's based on data, I'll show the prices. Now, exactly. So, for example, when we do the interviews, I send the transcripts of the interviews to them, and I say, is this correct? And they can edit the transcripts of the interview because it's respecting their and that's what they should do. That's what we all do. Share. They took their time to help me. You deserve to respect. It's respect. Yeah, it's a question. So in one sense, you're paying them for their time, so it's really like a job. But on the other end, are you paying them for their time, or are you paying them for the answer? And that's so what I've done is I've given like vouchers to certain stores. So it's not paying, they're not getting money, but they still get something. I want to see what we've got here, because as people were talking about, and I talked to two groups, I think, some questions came up that were really good questions based on these notions of ethics. So one of them was, if participants have agency, then do they have a right to see the results of your research? And I say yes. You should always share the results of your research with your participants. Like, if they gave you the time to talk to you, you should give them the time to show them what the results of that conversation was. So yes, if they ask, show them the results of their research. It also lets them know a little bit of like, I contributed to this. This is a little piece of me. So you should definitely share it. Another thing that came up was, if you're doing interviews or focus groups, show them the transcripts and give them the opportunity to change anything if they don't agree with what they said.
To be more reliable as well.
Huh?
To be more reliable as well.
Exactly, much more reliable. So yes, so if you do interviews or focus groups or whatever like that, where when you get the transcripts, share it with them and give them the right to change it. Right? So definitely. So share the results of your work. So if something gets published, share it anyway, because it's nice to share what you publish, but share it with them so they can see it. definitely. Were there other things that came up? So that's just based on the groups I talked to, but were there other things that came up when thinking about your research?
In terms of these ethical issues?
In terms of ethical issues. Yeah. Go for it. Yeah.
Students may hesitate to speak freely if they know their willingness will be published in the research. That is why we should take this point or this issue into our consideration. The second one, academic staff of these media departments at universities may not talk about weaknesses and issues of their departments with their names that are why their names should be covered. The name of university should be covered because when we do the research of their media department, this may affect their reputation and students' desires to study in such departments.
Yep. So you were thinking of doing, I think, work at two institutions, a private one and a public one.
Yeah, private and public.
So what I would do is, public university, this many students, this department. Private university, this many students, this department. And assuming it's a department that many universities have, it's difficult to track, but you've given enough contextual difference so we can now compare them. We can now do a comparison.
We can, another point, the names of research interviewee will be anonymous by using a particular code.
Yep.
So using.
Yep. And there are different ways of anonymizing, and that's up to you how you want to do it. So some people will just talk about student A, student B, student C. Some people will actually give them like fake names so that you're at least using a name. So there's lots of ways of anonymizing, but the key is to keep track of how you've anonymized, so systematically, so you know when I say student B, you know exactly who that is as the researcher, but nobody else. Yeah.
What would be your recommendation in a scenario in which your participant has read your work, your research, and he or she says, I don't like your findings or your conclusions, please don't publish?
Ooh. So it depends on what they don't like. So if they feel that you've misrepresented what they specifically said, then ask them for clarification. Okay, well, what was it that you said? Because it's about what they said. If they don't like the overall study, that's a different story because they're now trying to silence other people who you also use in the research. And at that point, you have to back off and say, unfortunately, this is the results of the whole study. So it's always why they're not liking.
One question. So this is something that happened in my PhD. So in the first study, because it was two studies. In the first study, the consent protocol, in the ethics protocol, I said that participants have the right to withdraw from the study anytime.
Yes.
And then after that, in my second study, I got a bit smarter because then that means if even I have finished my PhD, then they can go back and say, well, I need my data to be withdrawn and now I am done. So instead, they said you are allowed to say you are allowed to withdraw up to a certain point.
Yeah,
with this data. How is that in UK? I mean, is it possible to actually restrict withdrawal to a certain point?
Yeah, so usually what you do is you say, you can withdraw at any time during the study. So the idea is once the study's done, if you publish it, the study's done. But the second thing is, your responsibility as a researcher at that point is to destroy the data.
Yes, that's I know, but I mean, can you...
So you can't use it for other studies.
Of course, but I mean, can you, instead of saying during the study, saying up to the point of your participation or up to 48 hours after your participation?
I've never seen that before, so I would be a little hesitant. But by saying up to the conclusion of the study, you have because by the time you're publishing the study's over, you don't publish before, well, I guess you could, but, right? And so the idea is you've given them time to reflect. Because I had a participant in my doctorate who, beautiful interviews, but because I was asking questions about critical thinking in a context in which there was an authoritarian regime, it was about 2 months after she did the interview that she said I got scared. And she goes, please withdraw me. And I said, and I had to. I mean, I had to respect that. It made it difficult because I was already starting to write, but she had that right. So it's one of those things that it's a pain.
I know, but I mean,
You have to respect it.
Yeah, of course, but I mean, our ethic protocol, you would have restricted withdrawal time in Canada.
Okay.
Because it was included in the consent form.
Yes.
That they will, information sheet that they should be given, saying, so in my second study, I remember saying, oh, you can withdraw up to, I think was saying data collection completion, something like that, but not up to the end of the study.
Yeah.
Because by then I would have included in statistics and stuff.
Yeah.
It would have been harder for me. So I mean, between my extreme in my first study saying it's open and you withdraw, to the second one where I restricted something.
Yeah. And if you're going to restrict, just make sure that the amount of time you're giving the restriction is enough for them to change their mind also, right? They don't want a 24-hour period because they may not have had enough time to think about it, right? And also, if you're sending back the data to them to approve, that reduces the chances that they will pull out.
But I mean, these all have to go through an ethics committee too, so they saw that I am putting this relation in my second study, and for some reason.
Yeah. And we've hinted at, consent form is what we've hinted at. So what's standard is having a consent form that people sign. Now, having said that, you also need to think of the culture and the background of the people you're talking to. So if to them the written word doesn't mean as much, or they're not as literate, you need to make sure that they understand that form. So if you need to back it up with verbal consent as well. So make sure you always have the type of consent that they understand.
Referring to an unexpected mistake, such as taking a photo for some community or children, and in the background there is women, and in that community there is respect or just like habit for that community. Women shouldn't be in a photo or something. The community, they don't know, so you have to refer to that unexpected or on-purpose mistake.
Absolutely, you must respect the cultural practices of the people that you're talking to. And so if they don't like particular people to be in photos, you do not use photos of those people. You respect the community.
I have a question about researchers' ethical issue. They put in the British University, there is an application form, filled out that is regarding the ethical issue. For example, when I did my PhD, it was about media and politics. So my research was about some of my research was about corruption. So it was a serious issue.
Yes.
But I made some justification because I wanted to do that. But it's better to put with those research a serious topic or a sensitive topic, or just leave it for others.
No. So I don't want this to make you say, okay, I'm not researching sensitive topics. No. What I want you to do is, how do I do it in a way that's respectful? So that's the story here, is not don't do sensitive topics. Do it. How do you do it in a way that respects the participants? So that's all I want you to do, is be thinking about how. So you don't go running in there and cause damage, but you stop and you reflect and you say, okay, as part of my design, how do I ensure I am being respectful? How do I protect these people? And not just physically, but mentally, psychologically, employment-wise, culturally respect them. How do I do these things? And once you design it thinking of those things, then do the research. It's great. It's wonderful. You can learn from it. So don't shy away from sensitive topics, but be very critical of yourself in the design period. What are the ethics here? And how do I be ethical? And you can be. There's always a way. You just need to be really creative in your thinking. And then write about it in your actual article. Be honest about the ethics and be honest about how you dealt with those ethics. And that's time. All right. So tomorrow we'll be doing theory. Oh gosh, you thought ethics was... So theory, methodology. So not just data collection, but methodology, the whole mess. And then finally ending with grants, and writing successful grants. Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much.